Simon Harries, welcome to the Pacey Performance Podcast. Thank you for giving up some of your morning to have a chat.
Oh, thanks for having me, Rob.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. Like I was saying before, you have produced probably one of the top 5 ranking articles on Sportsmith. So we're going to use that as a bit of a jumping off point today for a running rehab framework chat. However, before we dive into that, would you mind just giving us a bit of a background on you? Because I know there's been some changes recently, but I'm sure there's always a backstory. Everyone's always got a backstory.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm an S&C coach, firstly, and then secondly, a sports scientist. I've always worked in contact-based field sports, so I've actually progressed across all 4 contact codes that are offering in Australia: Rugby League, Rugby Union, Rugby Sevens and AFL. And along that journey, which is around 13 or 14 years, for nearly half of that, 6 years or so, I've been a rehab coordinator in various places that I've been, which is, obviously how I got that kind of expertise in and the idea around, a rehab running framework and so on. But recently I have had a career change, as you said, and I've moved across into the institute system, with Olympic and Paralympic sports, and I'm now the head of S&C at NSWIS, or the New South Wales Institute of Sport.
How's that transition to an institute from team sports?
It was so different initially. Just understanding the lay of the land, and there's so many more inputs from different sports and different funding bodies, and understanding all the interactions in that space. And then just the day-to-day pace is very different. And now instead of looking at the next month or the next upcoming season, you're also thinking, okay, this upcoming season, but what about next year, the Com Games, which is actually this year, and the next Olympics now in 3 years' time, and so forth. So it's just a bigger picture of the world, I would say.
So are you over for the Com Games is it July, Com Games?
Yeah, it is. No, I won't be going.
Okay.
But a whole lot of the athletes that we service here will be off to there.
Of course. So your position is overseeing the S&C coaches that live with different sports, or do you have an allocated sport as well?
Both. So
okay, yeah.
There's a fairly large team here. I think there's 11 of us or 12 that then service 15 plus sports, plus a whole lot of individual athlete scholarships. And then at the moment I'm with water polo, the women's water polo program. Yeah, which is really enjoyable. Basically, it's underwater rugby to me. So there's a little bit of comfort in there. That makes it sound
so cool.
Yeah. Well, I'm learning. But at some point, I will, with the new role change, I'll transition out of that a little bit and pick up another sport or two, depending on how that all fits with the other staff.
And some big shoes to fill in this new role, as we've been discussed beforehand.
Yeah. Alex Natera, very big shoes to fill. Thankfully, he's my boss still, so he can point me in the right direction if I get off track.
Nice. So what's last one on the background stuff? What's after Com Games? What's the next big milestone, I guess, for you?
Well, I suppose with this, there's so many different sports and so much going on. For me, it's probably less about what competitions are coming up. And the big focus for me is, I suppose, making sure that there's a good system in place within our S&C department, that we're, singing off the same page and are doing things in a way that, there can be some kind of consistency and legacy after the people that are here will leave eventually at some point. So I think, I enjoy systems and different things that can help, I suppose, guide the way we work. So I think I've put a fair bit of focus towards that and getting some of those things up and running.
Sounds good. Right, let's dive into the rehab running framework. So First off, the process that you went through, and anyone that hasn't checked it out, go on Sportsmith and have a little read, or long read, because it's pretty meaty, but there's so much there. So in terms of the process you went through to develop that, and we'll get into what it is in a second, but the process you went through to develop that. Just give us a bit of an insight into that.
Yeah, I suppose. So when I first moved into a full-time S&C role, and had a little bit of, responsibility in rehab, but not too much, I was exposed to more of a recipe-based approach to returning athletes to running and getting them back to their sport. Like follow this step, then this step, and then this step, and then this step. There was very little scope to go outside those steps. And then the next iteration that I was exposed to was maybe a little bit more of a menu, where you pick from, certain categories, but it was still very constrained into that little box. Which, reflecting on, preparing for today, like that was fantastic to learn and understand, okay, how might you just generally progress someone through rehab, and a few, I suppose, just how you could do it. But I suppose once you get a little bit more understanding of rehab and how you can progress different injuries, and also when your understanding of the sport or sports you're working in increases, you start to find those recipes and menus as too constraining. And so that's kind of how I suppose this framework came about, is that I wanted the ability to individualize a little bit and put my flavor upon, the recipes and the menus that were there. So I kind of just went about, in a similar way to which all strength and conditioning coaches would be thinking about their regression and progression system for a certain exercise, whether that's how do they teach someone how to do a good squat or a good hinge or so forth. Started to go with the same process of how would I progress or regress someone in terms of how they were running and returning to run post-injury. So that was probably the start of it, was give me, in my head, how I would regress and progress something, but give me the choice that allowed me the creative freedom to, if this athlete needed this, I could do so, or if this particular athlete, like from a psychological perspective, really didn't enjoy doing this, I knew I could also do this, this, and this, and still achieve the same goal.
That seems so intuitive, but it also makes me think, in terms of the education of a strength and conditioning coach, when it comes to rehab, because that, no matter what setting, and hundreds of people that have been on the podcast have mentioned the same thing, that fits under their remit. But from an education point of view, that's something that is almost missed, and people catch up later in their career with an extra certification or an extra master's, or just learn on the job. There seems to be quite a gap there.
Oh, there's an enormous gap.
Yeah.
And I was exactly like everyone else. The first time I was told, "Oh, can you take this player for their first rehab run?" I was so out of my depth, and I think there may have been a few mistakes in those early days that I'd like to take back.
What do you think the issues are for not having something like this in place that gives you a structure, but also allows you the flexibility to manipulate certain things depending on the various unforeseen things that happen during a rehab?
Yeah, I think the things that go wrong when you don't have something in place, and the biggest one is the consequence of a negative reloading response. So whether you're exacerbating the symptoms of that injury, or in the worst case, having a recurrence of that injury during rehab. And there's a balance, and you're walking a tightrope between, particularly if you're in pro sport and there's a demand to get the player back, you're walking a really tight line between being too conservative and too aggressive. So having a way in which you work, and some way to guide your decision making along the way is really important. And if you align, I suppose, your framework with the various stages of rehab, which are based in, I suppose, the pathophysiology of tissue healing and understanding the forces that a healing tissue may be able to withstand, then you're starting to align the two goals and go, okay, I understand where, from a healing perspective, where we're coming from. I'm getting more understanding of what the other practitioners that are involved, the medical practitioners are involved, like what are they thinking around this time point of the injury, and then I'm also overlaying that with, well, what am I thinking from a physical preparation perspective? You know, how can I align these three things at once and have an appropriate bandwidth of, okay, if we operate in this space at that time, we should be okay.
You started off in the article with a couple of nice tables with the color coded from left to right as the loading progressed, but also the healing progressed as well. Would you be able to just, I suppose, build out what that kind of description that I'm trying to paint in people's heads, what that looks like?
Yeah. So I suppose, I mean, for me, the terminology is less important. Essentially, you've got your couple of phases, whether it's 4 or 5 or 3, it doesn't matter. But essentially, you're in a period initially of, let's call it the acute stage, where really number one goal is protect the injury site and ensure there's no further damage and allow the healing tissue to do its thing, scar up, and so forth. You know, where you're still training in that period, but you're definitely thinking, I don't want to do anything that's going to disrupt the healing process. And then you take another step down the line and you go, okay, there's been enough healing that we can now reintroduce some load. And what that is, you know, different to every sport, whether that's load in a resistance training exercise, whether that's loading them to return to swimming in the water, whether that's loading to return to run and so forth. But it's a very graded process of introducing a little bit of load to the tissue. Can the tissue handle it? Yes. Take the next step and so forth. So you go through that period where you're kind of gradually just increasing what they're doing and what they can handle. And then you have this period that, you know, it's a piece of string on how long it is, depending on the injury, but where you're going, okay, can we recondition, or we need to now recondition that athlete to withstand the demands of their sport. And so that's where the real piece, where you always are thinking in the back of your mind, well, okay, we need to be cautious of whatever area was injured, but we're also thinking, well, how is that athlete prepared holistically to perform their sport? And then we move through that stage and go, okay, we've reconditioned them. Now let's have a period, again, a piece of string about how long this period is, for a stabilizing performance. And so when they're returning to play or returning to train, they're actually ready to perform, and they're not just going out there and everyone's fingers are crossed, hoping that they'll survive the next training session or the next match.
You gave an example in the article. Again, I'll keep referring back to the article because I'm using that as a bit of a framework for us to have a little chat today. But a bit of an example, you used, I think, grade 2 soft tissue injuries as the example further down the article. Just using that framework that you've just described there, can you just kind of overlay that example on that particular framework? Is that possible?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, in the article I used an example. So we had enough over the course of a couple of years of grade 2 hamstring injuries and grade 2 calf injuries. So I suppose if we were looking at those two injuries, the acute stage would be somewhere in the vicinity of 7 to 10 days, where we're really looking, as I said, to protect the injury site. And then throughout that period of time, you know, we're working on re-establishing range of motion, minimising any swelling, looking for pain to go away, and looking for strength, general strength to return, whether that's via a clinical assessment with the physios or some kind of, you know, quite basic assessment of strength in the gym. And then there'll be, let's call it the return to run, probably coincides maybe just after the start of the load introduction phase, you know, because we would have introduced load in the gym-based setting firstly. You know, kind of the strength and resistance training stuff is kind of 1 to 2 steps ahead of the return to running, if you can picture that. Then yeah, we return to run, and there'll be a period of, you know, potentially a week to 10 days of the load introduction for running. And then there might be a 7 to 10 day window or of reconditioning / performance phases. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So using one of the examples that you used in the article, which was hamstring framework. That's right, isn't it? That's the example that you used.
Yeah, you did. Yeah, you used an example. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. So the first thing that I wanted to dive into was I suppose one of the first things that comes along, which is running gait. Is there anything, just starting from, I suppose, step one, would you better take us through what that looks like in terms of examples of drills that you may use in that very, very early stage and how that would progress? And then one thing I've got written down here is how you determine entry and exit criteria. I know it's not okay, today we're doing this and everything then will change tomorrow because everything's aligned. I'm guessing that there's obviously certain things are aligned, certain things progress, certain things stay where they are, and it's always evolving. But what entry and exit criteria do you use to move along the framework? Two questions there, sorry.
Yeah, 2 questions there, no problem. So I think if we look at reintroducing running gait, and I'm absolutely no expert in improving someone's running gait in the way others are, but the way I think about it is, again, that, I suppose, graded progression of, well, if an athlete has to sprint maximally in their sport, then initially they need to start walking, jogging, running, striding, sprinting. So it's a really systematic process to return to those things. So initially, post a soft tissue injury and a hamstring, early on, it might be day 1, day 2 after the injury, we're maintaining through a range of walking-based running drills, whether that's an A walk with a stepping over the ankle height or over the shin height or over the knee in kind of like a dribble walk, and just doing a number of repetitions, very low volume, once or twice a day in that real early stage, then progressing to those same drills in a running, movement. So it's a dribble over ankles, a running dribble, or dribble over shins, dribble over knees, and so forth. Almost as this surrogate before actually going to jog. Mm-hmm. There's these running drills and running mechanics, they look very similar to actual running gait. Potentially the range of the motion, depending on the drill you choose, are reduced, not going to stress the tissue as much. And you can, I suppose, build a little bit of confidence there in the athlete and in the practitioner that if this athlete can tolerate a certain amount of running drills, then they should be ready to do a light jog. And I suppose maybe that's a good jumping off point into some of those criteria to determine when someone might be ready to run. Mm-hmm. So the way that we've done it would be, I suppose, you're pairing like the clinical side of the objective markers with the functional. So return to run, the physios would have their criteria, which would be something like there's no pain on contraction or in palpation. They've re-established full range of motion, and they may have a clinical measure of strength. Might be an isometric contraction, for example. Again, it might be a handheld dynamometer, or it might be using the Nord board to do some kind of isometric, just to establish, have they got, let's call it, sufficient strength to return to run, as opposed to returning to previous strength levels. And then with the functional kind of assessment and marker, could they tolerate walking running drills? Could they tolerate running drills that are running? Could they tolerate some entry level strength training, and some lower load eccentric contractions and isometric contractions and so forth? All right, done all those things, let's start running. And then along the way, it's almost like in my opinion, when you're looking at a soft tissue injury, particularly grade 1 and grade 2, because it's a real tight turnaround, like you're only talking kind of 3 to 4 weeks, you will have these key objective tests along the way, but you use function as your main driver for progression, which is why having a nice graded progression along the way for different components is useful, because you know, it's okay, they can handle now a light jog, whether that's at 12 kilometers an hour, 14 kilometers an hour, and so forth. You know, they've handled, let's say it's a kilometer of that type of work. All right, maybe the next session they can handle jogging a little bit faster, and then okay, they've done that for a session or two. Can they now handle to run at 18 kilometers an hour for 18, 19, 20 k's an hour? Yep, they've done that. Now let's go. Can they do easy striding? Now they've handled easy striding. It might be 70 to 75% of their maximum speed. All right, now we can start to push towards sprinting and looking at those percentages above 80%.
Before you go into that high-end stuff, is there anything critical that is, yes, functional, but gives you extra confidence, whether it be some sort of, I don't know, objective testing that allows you to go, okay, we're definitely ready. I'm not going to get into a situation where we're going back 2 weeks?
Sure. Yeah. So there's probably two main things there. There's respecting the healing time for a lot of these injuries. And so in particular for a hamstring, a grade 1, we'd be thinking that anything before kind of that 2-week mark, so day 14, it's a real critical period where the injured site needs to heal up and scar up pretty well before we expose it to kind of those higher end forces that would happen in running fast. So there'd be that, like waiting, you got to wait a little bit. But then also pairing that with an objective marker of, you know, we would use a Nordic as an assessment of eccentric hamstring strength, because we have a lot of information on that, and I don't want to get into the Nordic debate.
We'll go there again.
I'm neither here nor there on that, but it's a good assessment to give you a good guide of have they returned to their previous level of strength, and so we'd be looking at returning to, you know, within a nice ballpark of their previous best within a recency period, whether that's the previous 12 months or so forth, and then having, you know, an asymmetry side to side that's less than 10 to 15%.
Is that asymmetry a crucial thing for you?
Good question. Yes and no.
Okay.
It's not necessarily a major stop early on. And if they're still if they're 16, 17%, you know, at day 14, for example, you know, and in everything else, they're tolerating all the functional things that we're doing on the field and in the gym. They haven't had any sign of a negative reloading response. So they're, you know, from one session to another, they're pulling up quite well. You know, I might say, okay, we can still take this next step, but we'll proceed with a bit of caution. Mm-hmm. And, you know, that next step where if, let's say their asymmetry was only 5%, the step might be that size, it's a little bit bigger. And whereas in this case, it's a smaller step. But before they return to full training and definitely return to play, that I would want to see that asymmetry go down to less than 10%. I suppose the only, consideration would be, with all the information we had on that player, prior to injury, did they have a big asymmetry? You know, we had an example of a player who was a previous ACL reconstruction where they'd used the hamstring tendon for the graft. And so that player never, even upon 12 months return to play, they still had like a 20 to 25% asymmetry measured on a Nordic. You know, so if that player had a hamstring injury, for example, I couldn't possibly hold that criteria for that player.
So just going back to the framework, we've built up to potentially 80% plus. At what point and what criteria? I mean, we've touched on the criteria a little bit. What does that next step look like? Getting up to full max speed, and then potentially introducing some decelerations and change direction evasion stuff.
Yeah. So in the article, I kind of outlined the way in which I progress running speed really systematically early on up until around that 75 to 80% top end speed. In that I use, whether it's 100-meter repeat efforts or 60-meter repeat efforts, and having a set time to do those efforts corresponding to an expected, or an average velocity over the distance, and then an expected peak. I use that really systematically to rebuild the confidence of the athlete, but really importantly, their awareness of what a certain running speed feels like. So that when we do get above 75 to 80%, I'm able to have a conversation with them. I want you to go 2% faster than that today, or to that previous rep. It's 1% more, it's 3% more, it's 5% more, and so forth. And obviously, each athlete will be different in how well they can regulate those increases. But having that really systematic progression allows me that really tight bandwidth to progress it across repetitions within a session, and then also across sessions. And so I would, particularly with a hamstring, make some really gradual jumps from 75 to 80 to 85, because we know that as running speed increases for someone, the amount of work or forces that the hamstrings need to produce and absorb goes up, which is why a hamstring injury can run at day 3 or day 4 often, because it has less involvement and it doesn't have to do as much work at lower speed. But once you start to get above 80, 85%, it's really working, and you have to be really cautious of what you're exposing the injury to. So to come back to your question, once we've got to 80%, that may be around day 14 to 17, 18. Then if it's a grade 1, typically we'll hold off as long as we possibly can, but not too long before they go above 90%. Again, this is where you're balancing the risk versus reward, aggressive versus conservative, and that tightrope, and go, okay, if we just give them a little bit longer, when we take them up to this level, they're going to have had an opportunity to redevelop the strength that they need in that injured area to tolerate it. But then also balancing, well, from a reconditioning and performance perspective, before they return to play, we want to make sure they've been into those above 90, 95% zones on a number of occasions. And this is where that tightrope comes in.
And these are the balances. This is the balance that you will have had at the Giants when you've got a game Sunday, and you're pushing because he's the best player. So it's always that tightrope. Is he ready? Can we expose him at the right particular time, at the right particular number of days in? I suppose it's always that balance, isn't it? Mm-hmm. So in terms of we're getting up to that top end side, how do we transition or work alongside that with change direction, evasion, more, dare I say it, sport specific kind of movements?
Yeah, so with running gait and max velocity progressions, and then change direction and acceleration, deceleration, they are progressed at a similar rate.
Yep.
So, I'm not waiting for them to be able to run fast and then bring in the acceleration, deceleration components. If anything, the change direction and the accel and decel get progressed a little bit faster than the maximum velocity stuff with a hamstring injury. And so it's a little bit harder in change of direction and accel and decel to have a really clear percentage of progression. So it starts to look like a little bit more we're using descriptives. We're going, well, these are light intensity, medium intensity, moderate to high intensity, and high intensity. And the way I go about increasing that intensity is manipulating the size of the drill that they're doing. And so starting small spaces, small distances, doesn't allow a high velocity of change of direction or for the accel or decel. So I suppose it constrains the athlete at whatever period of rehab you're in to go, well, if I make the drill a certain size with these constraints, and then also give the athlete, I want you to go at a light intensity, whether that's 50, 60% of what they understand, and that constrains it at that time. They go, okay, now we've opened up the drill a little bit, so we're going to get a little bit more speed into a change of direction, which is going to increase the force demand for that change of direction. But then it still say to them, okay, I still want you to hold this at a medium intensity. We're not going, full on just yet. And then as you progress through the rehab running framework, sizes get bigger, and we bring in more constraints that start to make it look a little bit more like the sport, whether that's, very artificial constraints such as adding in a stopping zone for a deceleration, or having multiple coloured cones and the athlete responding to my call, or a visual cue via like an app you can use and that gives you the different colours like randomly, or it's bringing in a coach or a practitioner to be a person that reacts, and then they react off the coach. And then finally, the last step is, okay, can we bring in more than one coach, bring in a couple of players or multiple coaches to do some simulated training drills, which are, modified and constrained based on the rules we put in place for that drill. Again, the sizing, the conversation we have with the athlete beforehand to say, we're doing this drill. I know you want to do this for this purpose, for your sports skill preparation, your technical preparation, but we're doing it for this reason from a physical perspective. And these are the things that I want you to do in this drill. Perform the drill or drills, and that's the next logical step towards going back towards training with the team.
That was one of my questions, actually. How much input along the way, and I suppose it'll differ depending on the athlete themselves, but how much input are you asking from them in terms of how quickly you're progressing? I know I mentioned about we've got a game on Sunday, so things may be sped up or slowed down, but how much input are you getting? How are you actually getting that input from the athlete?
They have a huge say in their progression. In terms of, we'll have conversations with this is where you are right now. This is what we're seeing with you in the gym. This is what we're seeing with some of your objective testing and so forth. Like, we think you should be able to do this on this day and then do this and then play. Are you happy with that plan? Is there anything you'd like to change? Like, obviously that within a tight time frame, you can't change too much. But the athlete might say, look, just on that day, if I can do this on that day, I'll be happy and it'll give me the confidence to play. So most definitely we will adjust some of the content within a session to make sure the athlete gets what they need, as long as it fits within the parameters of where they're at in that rehab journey.
Mm-hmm. I know you used, like I said before, you used the example of the calf and the hamstring, and you did some comparisons and presented some data really nicely on there as well. Can you just talk to us a little bit about the differences in terms of how you would progress and regress those different injuries as you presented in the article?
Yeah, so I think it comes down to like one main difference. Essentially, as I mentioned just a moment ago with hamstrings, but basically the forces that are required to be produced and absorbed during running for the plantar flexors or the calf, they have a really high force requirement just from entry level jogging, slow speed jogging. It's really quite high, particularly the soleus muscle from slow running, and then it does go up to a certain level, but it's quite high from early days. Whereas with the hamstring or the hip extensors, they're less involved or have a less of a force requirement during slower running. So the main difference is with the hamstring, as running speed goes up, essentially the amount of work and force that needs to be produced and absorbed by those muscles goes up. So you get with a hamstring, you need to delay running fast a little bit longer. Whereas with a calf, and this is where the differences in the what I highlight in that article around the day of return to run, with a calf you wait a little bit longer. I suppose you're waiting for a little bit more healing of that tissue, give it a little bit more time to scar up and get its strength back before returning them to such a high load activity that starts with easy entry level jogging. It's quite high from a force perspective and what has to happen and be absorbed at that area. Whereas with a hamstring, you might have a hamstring that could run at day 2 or day 3 post injury and tolerate a substantial amount of volume early on, but you just have to wait from a speed perspective. They're kind of the main differences in just from a rehab running perspective and why you would wait a little bit longer for a calf before running, but you can actually accelerate them a little bit quicker, because as I said, the calf musculature starts working pretty early in slow speed running, and it does go up, but it doesn't go up enormously as running speed increases. So you can kind of kick them on a little bit more.
Is there any particular nervous points in a calf rehab, like there would be in a hamstring getting up to that top end? Is there any nervous points in the calf rehab that would mean that you have a particular objective measure again to give you that confidence, like you might do with the Nordic? Is there anything that replicable with the calf?
Yeah, the calf is a lot harder to assess and have a really good measure of strength. We did play around with a range of isometric tests, whether that's in a seated position or a standing, using force plates to get an idea of their peak force and side-to-side differences and so forth. If it was a significant calf injury, like potentially a grade 2 or most definitely like a grade 3, we'd also have some kind of reactive strength measures such as a drop jump or a repeated hopping test on the force plates and getting an idea there. But with let's call it a simple grade 1 calf or even a grade 2 calf that doesn't have any involvement of any of the tendons that run through, we're probably most nervous when we get to a certain session volume. Because again, harping on about it, but the calf needs to work so hard during all speeds of running, particularly the slower end speeds. So volume can be the thing that brings you unstuck early days. So when we get to a session, and these AFL players, like their game loads, like their game average is somewhere between 12 to 14 Ks that they have to cover in a game. And that's not even including the warm-ups that they do. So, you're talking maybe a 15 to 16 K dose in a day. So when we get to somewhere around the 5 to 6 kilometer mark in a training session, that's the volume that will often bring a calf unstuck if they're not going to tolerate the progressions that you've done. So the way we approached a calf was delay the volume, progress the competency of function, whether that's running fast or accelerating, decelerating, change of direction, sport-specific skills. We're still progressing those things, but just in terms of the overall volume that they are needing to do in the first 3 to 4 sessions of returning to run, we were super cautious and would keep that well below that, a pretty arbitrary number, that 5 to 6 K mark. And I reckon if an athlete didn't run 12 to 14 Ks in their game, that arbitrary figure may be even lower than that. It might be at 3 or 4 Ks for someone who might only run 6 or 7 kilometers in their sport.
One thing I want to next ask you is overlaying the resistance training on top of this. Didn't touch on, well, we did mention this in the article, but maybe not loads, but it'd be great to kind of run back through that framework as well and just piece together how resistance training develops in that calf and hamstring examples as well.
Yes, I suppose, like, what I said earlier, the rehab running framework came from, I suppose, what we all do as strength and conditioning coaches in having a regression and progression continuum in different categories of exercises and movements and so forth. So in a similar way to which the rehab running categories progress, for each injury, the calf, hamstring, quad, you would have a regression progression continuum of exercises and movements that I suppose, that you would align based on your experiences and understanding of those exercises, the load, whether lower load to start with, higher load, higher rate of loading, or complexity of the movement along the way. And then, so you have those regressions, progressions sorted. And then with resistance training within rehab, it kind of runs 1 to 2 steps ahead of the return to running. And that you go, okay, like real simple, can they tolerate a certain amount of load in a slow movement, with a really slow contraction velocity? Can they now tolerate forces with a higher rate of loading, starting to bring some speed in the movement, whether that's some introductory plyometrics or jumping, whether that's, potentially like a faster resistance training movement, like with a quicker eccentric or a quicker concentric action in the movement. And you're doing those things along the way, and they're giving you that indication along with the early stage part of rehab running, talking about the running drills and running mechanics. Going, okay, we're starting to see that a bit of a picture here. Athlete can tolerate some running gait in running drills. They can tolerate a certain amount of loading in slower velocity movements, and they can tolerate and are showing they can handle and not pull up poorly from exercise that have a higher rate of loading. We have some confidence to get them back running. And then along that journey from the returning to running, you're looking to progress, just keep with the resistance training side, just a step ahead of running. So that potentially you are, inverted commas, returning to normal resistance training well before you're running at 80% of your top end speed, for example.
Do you think this side of it, in terms of the resistance side of a rehab, is something that maybe people think is more complicated than it is, or when it's just good strength and conditioning principles, but maybe, like you said, that one step ahead? Or does it coincide with what we said at the start, with, more education needed from that perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I'd answer that question, is it that some people overcomplicate it, in 2 ways. Yes, it's overcomplicated when you're talking about a injury or injuries that have a very low severity, like 3 to 4 week injuries. Injuries in that severity, for me, it's progress along the continuum and then return to play. And along the way, identify, if there's anything that's a risk factor that needs to be addressed and changed in that 3 to 4 week period, or as an ongoing strategy that needs to be worked on once they have returned to training and play. However, in a more complicated and severe injury, like an ACL, no, I don't think we complicate it in that type of an injury, or whether it's a grade 3 hamstring injury. We do need to be really systematic and be thinking very, very broad in how we're preparing the injury site, but then the athlete holistically, and addressing all underlying risk factors, using as an opportunity to improve physical capacities and things that may be potential weaknesses in that athlete, using as an opportunity to improve their strengths further. So yeah, I'd answer that question very differently depending on how long we're expecting them to be out of their normal sport.
So we've mentioned Alex. You've mentioned isometrics a couple of times. So we need to tick that box as well in terms of the run specific
Sure.
isometrics, which obviously Alex is the man when it comes to that kind of thing. But where do they fit in this? I suppose this could be the kind of bridge between the two, potentially, that resistance training theme, that's strand, and the rehab running framework strand. Is that how you see run specific isometrics?
So I see them probably as, obviously they can be like this early introduction of loading in rehab, and someone can tolerate isometrics exercise, whether that's run specific isometrics or just general isometric exercises really early on in rehab. And I use the isometrics in rehab probably more in the way of enabling a higher frequency of loading, in that, for example, a hamstring may not be able to tolerate, more than 2 or 3 good doses of eccentric work in a week, whereas isometrically they could potentially do some isometrics every single day. So you can have really high frequency of loading if that's what you need. And then I suppose the run specific ISOs is then using that as that's a tool to be a little bit more specific and relevant to the angles that are required in running. And so that's where I'd probably more tailor the isometrics that I do towards those run specific ISOs, whether that's a hip ISO or the ankle ISO, in those angles. And as I said, one of the goals of bringing in resistance training is having a higher rate of loading. So throughout a rehab, I'm going to progress along Alex's continuum of isometrics and how he describes them to go, there might be some holding or pushing isometrics to more of the switching type isometric where the rate of loading is going up.
Do you think, in terms of isometrics, they're often in rehab, they're often seen as that lower end, and then it kind of dissipates to what your traditional strength training, whereas actually there is potential to keep that, like you say, with Alex's framework throughout the whole rehab?
Yeah, there's definitely that scope to keep it. I'm not sure what others are doing, whether they're just pulling isometrics out early because someone's returned to like normal strength and conditioning. But yeah, there is a hell of a lot of value in keeping them in and progressing them further at the back ends of rehab, where you're also stressing them with their on-field running demands, and potentially, I suppose, filling up their bucket of capacity for the day in their injured tissue, or just generally for what they can tolerate in a day. And isometrics can be, you can get a really high level stimulus in terms of force output, but with a really low mechanical cost. And you can do that quite frequently, as I said. So yeah, I think they can be, very utilized at the back end of rehab.
Final question on that, on isometrics. When it comes to a hamstring, how would that isometric, I know you mentioned about Alex's framework there, but how would the isometrics progress very quickly before I let you go? Because I know you've got to shoot.
Yeah, so I suppose, isometrically would be like a simple hamstring bridge isometric with a bent knee position. So then progressing to a straighter angle, and to, I suppose, Alex's entry, hip isometric hold. And so the way I would progress that initially would be, okay, we're doing this exercise, but the duration of the holds may be lower. They might only be a 5-second hold initially, or a 10-second hold. And then I'll progress and say, well, the next session, you tolerate that. Let's now do a 15, 20-second hold and obviously multiple sets. The next progression might be add a little bit of load to that movement. Let's put a 5 kilo, 10 kilo plate across the hips. Then once they can handle a little bit of load in that holding isometric, then moving towards not a true switch, but I suppose a switch where there's a period of both feet as a base of support and then a transition off. So there's a change in, an increase in the rate of loading there, but it's not a true switch. Then progressing to a true switch where there is a period where there's no foot being a base of support. There's a true switch and a really quick contraction and development of force to maintain that hip hold position. And then once we're probably at that point with a switching isometric, that's probably the level that I would take them to for a hamstring injury.
Superb. Right, and now I'm pushing it for you to shoot off. But Simon, thank you very much for that. Like I say, anyone that hasn't checked out the article, make sure you do, because top five, potential top three. I haven't looked recently. But if anyone wants to catch up with anything that you've got going on, are you a social media guy or a little bit?
I'm not. I am,
okay.
But I'm also not.
Okay.
So I'm probably best contacted on Twitter. Yeah. And as you've asked that question, I've realised I didn't even look to see what my Twitter handle is. So I'll look it up now.
Is it Simon K. Harries? No.
No, I think it's my last name. Yeah, it's Harries _Simon.
Is it? Okay.
So it's HARRIES
okay.
_Simon. Nice. Yeah.
Don't know where I've got.
So that's probably the best.
Don't know where I've got that from. Mine. Maybe I'm tagging.
That's
tagging
my email.
Oh, is it? Okay.
No, or my Instagram.
Oh, is it? Okay. Fair enough. I'm not just making that up, but yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I need to be better at social media and putting my thoughts out there and interacting in that space. But, you know, I'm not as savvy at it as Alex is. Let's put it that way.
No, that's good. Right. Thank you very much for giving me an hour of your time in this morning for you, this evening for me, and I'll let you crack on. But really appreciate it, Simon. Keep the good work, and thanks again.